Okay, then. Those who can, I would request you to turn on your videos. It's always nice to see all the faces. I know a lot of you are doing very well in the practice. I love to see the smiling faces. Great. So, as I mentioned, there is going to be a fair amount of repetition because we are dealing with fairly complex concepts. They are very fundamental concepts, but like I mentioned, for some reason or the other, they don't seem to be a part of our education, right? So, dealing with ourselves, dealing with our mind, dealing with how we experience the world seems to be the first thing. So, it's often said, right? You cannot testify to any other fact other than the fact that you have experience, right? So everything else that you see about the world is something that is created in your mind, right? So the brain itself, for example, does not receive any information directly from the outside world. All the experiences are happening somewhere as related to processing that's happening in the brain, right? And the brain itself doesn't have any connection with the outside world. It is receiving all its information from different sensory bases and the information that is flowing through them. And if there is one thing that we can actually attest, that one thing that really exists in the world, that is our experience, right? But the way we learn things in our education is that the outside world exists first and foremost, and we learn about how things interact in the outside world and how we interact with the outside world. It's an interesting thing, but I won't get into too much of the philosophical side, because what we want is to be able to understand our experience and be able to use it to change our lives. So there's a lot of interesting things that can be thought about, but we'll discuss things that affect what we learn in our experience, right? So some of the things that we discuss during our talks will be things that you can immediately bring into your practice. Some of these are simply markers for what you're going to experience in your practice. So the reason for sharing them is that when you get deeper and deeper into your practice, you'll start seeing them for yourself. I'll quickly recap what we discussed over the last couple of days. We started with understanding the mental skills. We started by looking at why attention is important. The fact that attention acts as the thread that connects our life's experience. So it is the backbone of our life's experience. What we attend to is the experience of our life. What we do not attend to does not exist in our life's experience at all. And as we sit, as we practice, we realize that our attention is not really as cooperative as we think it ought to be. Right now, we ask our mind to do a simple task, to stay with the object of meditation, right? Anchor for our attention, and it keeps moving from one thing to another. To train our attentional skills, to understand more about attention, what we do is we start building the skills with attention, being able to identify how attention moves from one thing to another, remembering to observe that movement, remembering to observe where our attention is, how it is engaged with the contents of our consciousness, how different things are vying for our attention. Some of them come up, they're not able to take our attention away, and they dissipate. Some of them come up and they take our attention away. And what is the process by which our attention moves from one thing to another? This is the skill of mindfulness, being able to remember to observe how attention moves from one thing to another. Then we talked about being able to skillfully work with our attention and get it back to where we intend it to be when it has become distracted, especially if the distraction is not something important that requires our immediate attention and action. Many times we have thoughts coming up that don't really result in any kind of learning or any kind of action. We just keep ruminating in them. We either spend little time in them, or sometimes we might spend a lot of time. And those are things that we call rabbit holes, where we get lost, where we spend a lot of inordinate amount of time, don't learn anything useful, don't end up doing any useful actions. So we use the 6 R's or harmonious practice, recognize that our attention has drifted to something, let that new object be, relax the tension and tightness that develops in our mind. This tightness is what is latching our attention onto that object. It is the basis for that. It is a tangible manifestation of craving. Once we have relaxed the tightness, smile, start moving our mind towards a uplifted state and return to our object of meditation or whatever useful activity that we are engaged in. And repeat as often as required. So we are developing these attentional skills. And the mind, like a child that absorbs whatever is happening in its home, whatever the parents are doing, the kind of the way they act, the way they react to situations, the way they speak, the way they communicate, the way they treat others. So the mind is also learning continuously by the actions that we show it. The mind learns through actions, not just intention. As we repeat this action, as we re- continue to be mindful and continue to use harmonious practice, the mind starts to learn that what we really want is to stay with the object of meditation, and that there is nothing immediately relevant, immediately requiring our attention. And as it starts to learn this, it starts to stay effortlessly, not through force, not through being overpowered, but effortlessly it starts to stay with the object of meditation, or it starts to stay with the activity, useful activity that you're engaged. And this starts to result in deep states of collectedness known as jhanas. So this is the third skill, collectedness, being able to effortlessly stay with an object because you intend to do it without getting distracted. So once your mind is assured that there is nothing extremely challenging, threatening that is happening in its environment, it stays there easily. And that's what we would like, right? So if we know useful activities that are we would like our attention to be placed in, we would like our attention to cooperate with us and stay there. So as the mind sees these actions, after some time it starts to stay there. What is also happening is every time we use the 6 R's, we are reducing the craving in our mind, the craving that is associated with different objects that are coming up in our awareness. So these are the three skills that we covered. And with the jhanas, as we start getting into these collected states, we start seeing some changes in our practice. We may notice some symptoms. We may stop feeling some the intensity of signals from our body. We may start feeling the feeling of loving kindness moving up to our head or to our mind. We may find that we are able to sustain the feeling, stay with the object without having to verbalize the wishes, support it. The feeling has become more natural. These are all signs of going deeper and deeper into the jhanas and our mind getting more and more collected. As we go deeper into the jhanas, more and more mechanisms that are related to scanning the environment continuously, restlessly, looking for signs of opportunities or threats, those start to calm down, and we are able to see the remaining events with a lot of clarity and start to really understand for ourselves. In our own experience, we start to see how mind's attention moves. Okay. So, with respect to that, so today's talk is going to cover a little bit about zooming in deeper and deeper about a particular instant, what makes up our experience at a very single instant of time. What are the components that come together for that? One other thing that we discussed before we dive into this was the distractions. What are the hindrances to our development of our mind. And we talked of these in terms of the two twins of greed and aversion, treating things as threats and opportunities, even if they are not actual threats and opportunities. Because as human existence has become more and more complex, something as simple as somebody saying something to you that can be interpreted as not flattering, right? That can seem like a threat. Some piece of information, some alert on your phone can seem like an opportunity. So, far away from the actual threats and opportunities that our prehistoric ancestors experienced, we have a very different way of understanding threats and opportunities today, right? So, greed and aversion represent that. Then we have the other set of twins, restlessness and sloth. Restlessness is that desperation to continuously seek information in the environment so that we can modify the environment to our benefit, right? So can we do something so we get more opportunities and less threats. And sloth is the counterpart of that, which comes from overstimulation, continuously being restless, comes the fatigue that prevents us from being alert, that prevents us from having energy in whatever we are doing. And finally, the other insidious sibling, which is doubt, right? Uncertainty, the longing for someone to come and give you a guarantee that what you're doing is right, that things are going to be fine. So, fear, uncertainty, doubt, that is the other insidious sibling. So, hindrances to your mental development, hindrances to being able to stay collectedly with something that is useful, something that is wholesome, come in these different flavors. So today we will dive into, we talked about attention being the backbone. We talked about different thoughts at, or thought processes at different points of time. Now we're going to really go deep into one single instant in time, right? And what we will use, like I said, the Buddha used to use two techniques a lot. One was root cause analysis, seeing what is dependent on another and what is the relationship of these two things and what is the nature of that dependence. Does removal of the base affect the removal of the next phenomenon? That is one technique that he used a lot in his teaching. The other he used was classification of different elements of experience, right? And different types of, so for example, hindrances are a type of classification as well. So today we'll cover something known as the 5 aggregates, which make up the ingredients for any moment of experience. I'll just share my screen, show some, use some visual aids to discuss this. Okay. So the first of the aggregates that the Buddha taught was the what you can call the physical realm, right? So physical realm includes matter, it includes things like anything that is observable in the material realm. So this includes electromagnetic waves, information, etc. Right? So the physical realm has different sources of information, and we interact with our environment, we interact with the world using a set of sense bases that can process this physical information. So whatever we don't have a sense base for, we don't really process. The world for us constitutes of what can be processed or made sense of through these sense bases. What are these sense bases? There are 6 sense bases that the Buddha described. And chief among them is something that was that doesn't tally very much with the potentially the kind of what we learn in our school about the sense bases is the mind, right? So mind also, the Buddha said the mind is a base that processes mental information and treats it as a sense base. So the internal sense bases, those that form part of us and form our window to the world, our mind, eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. And we have the counterparts of that, things that can be touched, things can be seen. So visual information, auditory information, things that can be heard, information that can be heard, things that can be touched, things that can be tasted or smelled. So this is the realm of roop or form. So this is the first aggregate. So any moment of experience has form involved in it. So if even if you're thinking something, you have the mind as a member of the realm of form that is involved in that process. If you're seeing something, your eyes involved. If you're smelling something, your nose is involved. If you're tasting something, your tongue is involved. If you're having some kind of tangible experience, your body is involved. And if you're listening to something, your ear is involved. So this is the first of the aggregates. The next of the aggregates is called Vigyan or Vinyana in Pali. And this is a very interesting word. It's translated as consciousness often. And we can also think of it as discernment. So, what does Vigyan do? So, all the information that is coming in, right? So, we talked about the sense spaces, different types of information that is coming in. So, Vigyan allows us to separate that information. So, if you're getting a bunch of information, but we can't make sense of it, then it is not very useful. So, it starts processing the information. It starts identifying what are things that are similar, different, this starts to say, for example, if you see this image, we see a bunch of people, so we can discern the people from the background. We can discern one person from another person. We can discern somebody who has curly hair to somebody who has straight hair. We can discern that people have different complexions. We can discern that they have different heights. We can discern that they have different body shapes, and we can discern they have different genders, for instance. So consciousness allows us to make sense of information. Just having some light come from your screen is not enough to make sense of the world. Why do we have these aggregates? Why do we have the ability to discern information? Is because we are constantly responding to our environment and trying to take actions to ensure our survival. So we need to make sense of the environment. So Vigyan is a discerning ability. Another example is so there are not too many changes that is happening, right? The person that is shown here is not really moving too much. They're wearing the same clothes. They're not doing something very drastic. They're just making some changes in their facial expression. Some facial muscles are moving, very minute changes are happening. But any human who has interacted with other humans is immediately able to discern that these are associated with different internal states for the other person. Another example, a popular game, children's game called Where's Waldo. You're always required to identify this character in the striped shirt. And what discernment allows you to do, it the task is to identify a person wearing a striped red and white shirt. So your discernment allows you to see what is the background versus what are people. Then you can see people who are wearing shirts versus people who are not wearing shirts, people who are wearing spectacles and those who are not wearing spectacles. And by this process, you're able to identify where Waldo is. Right? This is the second of the aggregates. The third of the so the ability to discern information. The third of the aggregates is called Vedana or sensations. Now, what happens is we are getting a lot of information at any point of time. So I'm sitting here, I'm getting information from all the different sense spaces. So for example, I can discern that my feet are on the floor, my I'm sitting on a chair, I know where the chair ends. I'm getting some kind of sound of crickets in the background. I'm seeing different things on the screen from different faces to the slide that I'm presenting to you. So a lot of things are there. Where do I pay my attention? So Vedana allows us to attenuate attention to what is important. So just making sense of the environment is not enough. Trying to understand what in the environment actually requires our action. is very important, right? And Vedana does that by giving us very pleasant or unpleasant feelings. So this thermometer is an example of, say, unpleasant feelings at the bottom and pleasant feelings at the top. So good, very potent threat would be accompanied by a very painful feeling. And a very pleasant opportunity would be accompanied by a pleasant feeling, right? So sensations try to compress even before we understand what that opportunity is, because we are getting so much information and we need to prioritize where our attention is. Sensations allow us to direct our attention, and they are constantly seeing what is a threat or what is an opportunity in the environment. So I've shown you two images, something that looks tasty, something that looks like a pleasant place to be. These will elicit pleasant sensations from you. On the other hand, if you touch something extremely hot, that will immediately give an unpleasant sensation. And what this does is, this kind of unpleasant Vedana attenuates your attention so you can take action, right? So a threat is accompanied by painful sensation. Opportunity is accompanied with pleasant sensation. Another, a river jam packed with garbage, again unpleasant sensation. So along with the ability to make sense of information, we have signals. So even before we know what things are specifically, we get signals so that our attention is spent there. We have limited mental bandwidth. We have limited ability to make sense of the world. So we need to pay attention to the part of the environment that represents the biggest opportunity or the biggest threat. That's what Vedana helps us to do. The next is very interesting, and this is where, at least on this group, everybody who has some background with for all these words, right? So the translations in English are not really always very good, but because we understand, a lot of us would have some exposure to Sanskrit, we are able to understand things a little better, right? So if you look at Vedana, we have a sense of Vedana. If you look at Vigyan, we have a sense of Vigyan. This is another word that is translated typically as perceptions, but Sanya or Sangya is best understood as concepts. This is the next of the aggregate. So now that we, through our sense bases, we have received some information, we have started processing information, seeing what is different from what is similar to what, and we have started getting uh, a pre-conceptual signal of whether it is unpleasant or pleasant, whether it needs our attention or not. We next start to put a concept to it. So here you are sitting in front of a screen, right? And on the screen there is this little line, black line drawing that is there. But I think everybody on this call will be able to identify who this person is, right? So that is the power of concept. Cannot we don't always experience reality as it is. What we do is we compress reality down into a concept, right? So we are able to use very little information and try to represent it as a concept. So even now, for example, your mind thinks that we are in a conversation, although what's actually happening is that you are sitting in front of a mobile phone or a laptop and you have sounds and light coming from there. That's what's happening. I'm sitting very far away from you. But for all useful purposes, we are having a conversation, right? So this is very important, right? So being able to see the world as models is very important, because it's very difficult and very mentally expensive to see every single thing as it is, right? So we need to be able to identify concepts so that we can respond to the environment faster. Similarly, many of you, while using different applications on the internet, right, you would have asked to verify whether you're a human, right? So we have concepts of, we see these images, these are just pixels on a screen, but we are able to identify what is grass, what is road, what is a vehicle. And out of vehicles, we are able to identify what is a bus and establish, for the purposes of that application, that we are human. So we are using concepts. We are not seeing an actual bus. We weren't actually seeing Gandhiji. We are able to use concepts to represent reality. And this can go into a very complicated territory also. So we have a bunch of abstract concepts here: freedom, justice, success, exploitation. So we can have concepts that are as complicated as that, and concepts helps us to respond to the environment as well. So we receive information, we process that information, our attention is attenuated by things that are more pleasant or more unpleasant, right? And we start using models to represent reality so that we can respond to it. We can understand what is actually useful for us to do, and we can take that action. And the last of the aggregate. So at every instant, right, every experience that you're having, all these aggregates come together, and we'll just talk about that. Last of the aggregates is sankhara or sanskar. Again, a very interesting word, very unique to the Indian context, which is, and it can be translated as conditioning. It's often translated as formations or fabrications, but a good way to look at it as sanskar. As sanskar is as conditioning. So that's a very famous test. Anybody who's read up a little bit on psychology would know about the marshmallow test. So the test was quite simply that uh, was to try and predict whether delayed gratification is a sign of success. So what they did was run a long study over multiple years, and they asked children to sit in a room, and they kept marshmallows in front of them and said, if you have, I'm the person who's conducting the experiment says, I'm going out of the room for a few minutes. If you wait for me to come back, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And it would be 1 marshmallow that is left with the child. This image is a little incorrect that way. But if you eat that marshmallow, then I won't give you any. So the idea was that there is 1 marshmallow that is available for you. If you wait for 10 minutes, you'll get 2. Otherwise, you just eat that one. And they try to see, which kids would do better in life and, with certain definitions of success. And some children would choose that 1 marshmallow and some would wait so that they can get 2 marshmallows. So what is the difference? The value proposition is the same, right? So the success is the same, the opportunity is the same, 1 marshmallow versus another. Why do the children behave differently? Because they have different ways of value judgment, different ways of processing information, different ways of understanding things. So sanskara colors all the other mental activities that are happening, mental processes that are happening, sensations. One person may find a certain temperature of water unbearable, another person may find it very comfortable or even soothing, right? And one person may like, for instance, chocolate, another person may like vanilla, another person may like strawberry, right? It's all unhealthy sugar filled desserts, but there is a value judgment in operation. And these are driven by the actions we have taken in the past and the experiences we have had in life, right? So, and transmitted to multiple channels, right? So everybody, all of us have different preferences in terms of movie genres, what we find funny or offensive, right? So we will all have our own unique basis of personality. And that is known as sanskara. Okay, so just to recap, the 5 aggregates or the skandhas essentially means a heap or a pile, right? And what we are saying is we are essentially every moment of our experience, every slice. So we talked about the timeline of our attention. We talked about different thought bubbles and different thought processes that we may be involved in or stuck in. And now we are looking at an instant of time. So every instant of our experience is the interplay of all these experiences. So if you see on the right, there are the ingredients of ginger chai, right? So every moment of experience is like that. There is some contribution of form, what kind of information is coming in, what sense base of yours is processing it. There is some kind of qualitative experience associated with it, pleasant, unpleasant, overwhelming, so that is the Vedana. There is some understanding of what we are dealing with at any point of time. It may be a thought, it may be words that we use, it may be uh, visuals that we see, and we associate that. I'm, for example, looking at the screen, looking at different people, looking at a slide, looking at text, right? So understanding of what are the different things, a conditioning that flavors my specific experience versus somebody else who is receiving the same information, and finally consciousness or discernment that is actually allowing me to, for example, if I take a sip of tea, s- uh, see, differentiate between the flavor of the milk and the tea and the uh, spices in it, right? So consciousness or discernment allows us to process information, and any moment of time is consisting of these different elements. What is interesting is all these different elements are always in flux, right? So that's something that will set up a basis for things that we are going to discuss further. What you'll observe is none of these things are stable, none of these things are permanently the same as they were the moment before. So the interplay of these things, the specific way these things come together is what forms that experience of that moment for us. Okay. Just wanted to share that a little bit. I'll take a pause for any questions that you may have, and then there are a couple of things that I wanted to add to that.
I wanted to ask whether brain and mind is the same, because the picture that you drew, is it
Yes,
the
that
same?
is the limitation of being able to represent mind through an image. So, brain and mind are not necessarily the same. So, mind is what is processing mental information. So, let us use that as a definition, because today, so for example, and this is there is popular Western medical science agreement on this, that there are aggregates of neurons and aggregates of in the gut as well as in the heart, which make a lot of difference on our decision making. So historically it was always thought that the brain is the key decision maker, all the information goes there and all the decisions are made there. But a lot of decisions, like modern science says, that are actually being made in your heart and your gut, right? So anything, the part of us that processes mental information is mind. And in fact, this is one of the hard problems of consciousness, right? So where mind is part of the mental realm, part of experience, and the brain is actually a physical organ, and where does that handoff happen is one of the big challenges of modern science to understand that connect. So for our purposes, the mind is the base that processes mental information. Eye is the base that processes visual information, right? Ear is the base that processes auditory information. And the interesting part, right? So our ability to process information actually restricts our interaction with the world. So for example, if somebody is colorblind, they cannot differentiate between red and green, right? So your consciousness actually puts constraints on the way you can interact with the world. So humans cannot listen to ultrasound, or they cannot see ultraviolet lights. Other animals can hear these frequencies of sound and light, and they have a different experience of our world. So consciousness also, and our sense bases also, provide constraints of our, or limitations of our interaction with our environment and of the world. Agam, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Rajiv. Rajiv, when you say that they are in flux, is it that the categorical definitions of these constructs are in flux, or the order in which the brain would, or the mind would process these steps is in flux? That it's not necessarily the sensory perception would come first, and then Vijnana would happen, and the discernment would happen. The steps would always be same. Is that the flux, that the order of steps would vary, or the understanding of these category itself is in flux?
That's a great question, Agam. And so actually here we are talking about ingredients. So this, there is not an order. In fact, we look at a slice of time, and one of the topics that we're going to dive into next is how we go from one slice of time to the next. So that is actually looking at order. It's a very important concept called dependent origination. So the ordering, the sequence of how things are happening. Here we are talking simply about what are the ingredients. So when we have that cup of tea, at that time we are not talking about the order in which the ingredients were assembled together. when we are having that sip of tea, we are tasting all the ingredients together, right? So when we are having an experience of life, there is an element of consciousness, there information processing that's happening. There is an element of your the physical realm, rupa or form. There is an element of your conditioning that is coloring that particular moment. There is an element of concepts that you're attaching to that particular experience of that moment, and there is a qualitative element of experience which is represented as sensation, right? Pleasant or unpleasant sensation. So think of this as ingredients.
Okay. No, what I meant was, let's say the example of the stick, the person holding the stick. We would of course interpret it as, let's say, Gandhi walking around, right? But somebody who has no familiarity with this person, somebody who's not been there would obviously perceive it as a man, but not as Gandhi. So the
Correct.
conditioning or something is so. So is there the way we make sense of this, let's say, the image of Gandhi? Will the steps of our processing, will it always follow that it will be the image first, which is our vision will come in first, then discernment will happen, and then vijnana will happen, and then this will happen, or the
Yes, so we will
conditioning
actually
then?
get into that. So
Okay,
that process, and especially the impact that it has on how we respond, right? The so every moment that we interact with the environment is also followed by a response. So that is something we'll go into deeper later, and that has a specific sequence. Here, the idea that I wanted to communicate with today. So there will be a sequence of how things happen, but today
sure.
for today's discussion, right? The idea was to say that every moment has these different elements, and you correctly mentioned identified one thing, right? So just like I mentioned for consciousness, right? So each of these experiences are constrained of any individual are constrained by the specific way in which these aggregates come together for them, right? So for example, if I have defective eyesight, right? So there is a some deficiency in the roop, right? So if I take off my specs, so without this, I would be experiencing the world very differently than you. If I didn't have any vision, I would be experiencing the world very differently than you. Because I know Gandhi, I would be experiencing that image or the world very differently than you. And if uh, I know, so if I haven't ever tasted one of the ice cream flavors, then I would be experiencing the world very different, or that choice very differently than somebody who has, right? And the same goes with consciousness as well, right? So we are experiencing the world different from a bat, for instance, right? And the same holds with conditioning also. So if somebody uh, has, for example, conditioning of being afraid, they have a uh, internal mechanism of being very afraid of, say, a spider, right? Another person doesn't. So their experience of world is very different. So these aggregates come together to form every moment of our experience. How a particular moment of experience happens, so we'll get into that tomorrow.
RD,
So
just
you'll have
one
to be patient.
just I mean,
Yeah.
just to extend to, if I'm understanding this correctly, to extend the tea metaphor that you took, today we are saying that okay, there is ginger tea or masala tea, and these are the ingredients that go into making masala tea. And tomorrow we will go into the recipe of making masala tea for all practical
Perfect.
purposes, the steps of which
Perfect.
we will follow. Right?
Yes,
That's
that
the
is
things there.
absolutely. That is very
Okay.
well explained. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, great. I think many of you are starting to sit longer and longer. So I think we will end the session a little early today and allow you to have a good evening sit. Okay, and I will meet all of you during the check-ins tomorrow. If you have not, please do book the time for your check-in. And we'll end today's session with a sharing of merit.
Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you so much.
May suffering once be suffering free, and the fear struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May enlightened beings of mighty power share in this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow in our check ins.